We waited for years to adopt a child. My name is Charlotte Hayes. I am 38 years old. 4 years of paperwork, home studies, background checks, waiting lists, false starts that fell through at the last moment, and nights where Daniel and I sat on the kitchen floor because we were too tired to make it to the couch, wondering out loud if it would ever actually happen for us. I was a pediatrician. I had spent my career surrounded by other people's children, holding them, healing them, sending them home to families of their own, and every single day of that 4-year wait, I went home to an empty nursery I had painted a soft, hopeful yellow long before we had any legal right to hope. When we finally brought Lucy home, she was 5 years old, small for her age, with wide watchful eyes that took in every corner of a room before she'd step into it. I remember carrying her overnight bag up to her new bedroom while Daniel actually carried her, up the front steps, and I stood in the doorway watching the two of them and thinking, with a certainty that felt unshakable, that our family was finally, completely whole. That certainty lasted almost exactly 1 year. I should say, before anything else, that Lucy's early years before she came to us were hard in ways I will not describe in detail here, because they are hers to tell, if she ever chooses to, and not mine. What I can say, as her mother and as a physician who has spent 2 decades around traumatized children, is that trauma doesn't leave the body just because a child is finally safe. It settles into small, specific habits that look strange to someone who's never learned to recognize them. Lucy was afraid to sleep alone, so for months she slept with her bedroom door propped open and a nightlight burning until morning. She hid food under her bed, crackers mostly, sometimes half a sandwich wrapped carefully in a napkin, not because we didn't feed her, but because some deep, old part of her still didn't trust that the next meal was guaranteed. Loud sounds made her flinch and go very still, her small shoulders curling inward, her eyes darting to the nearest exit. I recognized every single one of these behaviors for exactly what they were. I had read the literature. I had sat across from other adoptive parents in support groups, nodding along as they described the same patterns in their own children. I understood, with the clinical part of my mind, that Lucy wasn't broken and she wasn't ungrateful and she wasn't testing us out of malice. She was a small person who had learned, through hard experience, that the world was not always safe, and she was doing exactly what any nervous system does under those conditions, protecting itself in the only ways it knew how. Daniel understood it too, in theory. He had sat in the same meetings I had. He had nodded along at the same explanations from our adoption counselor. But understanding something with your mind and living inside it, day after day, exhausted evening after exhausted evening, turned out to be 2 very different things. It started small. A sigh when he found crackers crumbled under her bed frame for the 3rd time that month. A clipped, tired tone when she woke us both at a.m. because a car alarm outside had sent her into a full-body shake. I told myself it was ordinary parental fatigue, the kind every parent feels, adoptive or not. I told myself it would settle as Lucy settled, as trust slowly, patiently, rebuilt itself between all 3 of us. But instead of settling, something in Daniel seemed to harden. He began coming home later from the construction company he owned, staying at job sites longer than the work required, as if our house itself had become a place he needed reasons to avoid. When he was home, I watched him watch Lucy with an expression I didn't want to name, not quite resentment, not exactly, but something adjacent to it, something wary and withholding, the opposite of how a father is supposed to look at his daughter. One evening, after Lucy had gone through a particularly difficult night, she'd woken up screaming from a nightmare, and it had taken almost an hour to calm her back down. Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table with 2 cold cups of coffee between us. And he said the sentence that changed everything. "Maybe we made a mistake." I remember exactly how quiet the kitchen was in the seconds after he said it. I remember the hum of the refrigerator, the same sound I would come to associate, over the coming weeks, with the worst conversations of my life. I asked him carefully what he meant, genuinely hoping that I had somehow misheard him, that there was some other, gentler interpretation available. There wasn't. He told me, haltingly at first and then with more force, that he didn't feel what he'd expected to feel. He said he'd imagined that loving an adopted child would come as naturally as it seemed to for other people, that some instinct would simply switch on the way it apparently had for me, and instead he felt tired, and distant, and increasingly like a stranger in his own home. He said the word bonded like it was a mechanism that had failed to engage, like Lucy was a part that hadn't fit correctly into a machine he'd built. I told him that bonding takes time, that it isn't automatic even for biological parents, that plenty of people describe a slow, building love rather than an instant one. I told him I saw it in my own practice constantly, parents who worried, in whispered voices during checkups, that they didn't feel the overwhelming rush of love the movies had promised them, and who came to feel it deeply, eventually. Through the accumulation of 10,000 small ordinary days. He nodded along as I said all of this. But something in his eyes told me he wasn't really hearing it. He was somewhere else already, somewhere I couldn't follow him to. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life, and not primarily because of Lucy's trauma, difficult as that was to navigate. They were hard because I was, in effect, parenting to people who needed patience and reassurance, my daughter, whose fear was written into her body in ways she couldn't always control, and my husband, whose withdrawal I kept trying, desperately, to interpret as something temporary. Something that more time and more therapy sessions could still repair. I threw myself into helping Lucy. We found her a wonderful trauma-informed therapist, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who worked with Lucy through play, patiently, over many months, helping her understand that her new home was not going to disappear, that the food in the pantry would still be there tomorrow. That a closed door at night did not mean abandonment. I read everything I could find on attachment and trauma recovery in adopted children. I changed my own work schedule, cutting back my hours at the clinic, so I could be present for the specific rituals that helped Lucy feel safe. The same 3 books every night, in the same order, the hallway light left on at a very specific angle. Daniel, meanwhile, continued to drift. The night that broke something in me permanently came about 10 months after that first quiet, devastating conversation at the kitchen table. Lucy had had another difficult evening, nothing unusual by then, just a hard bedtime, more tears than either of us had energy left for, and once she was finally asleep, Daniel and I sat down again, in the same kitchen. And he said the words I have never once, in all the years since, been able to fully forget. Maybe we should give her back before she gets older. I want to try to describe what that sentence did to me, though I don't know that I have adequate words for it. I am a pediatrician. I have delivered devastating diagnoses to parents. I have sat with families in the worst moments of their lives. I did not think there was a sentence left in the English language that could genuinely take my breath away. I was wrong. I looked at my husband, this man I had built a life with, a man I had once believed I understood completely, and I felt something in me go very still and very clear, the way I imagine the eye of a storm must feel. Calm, surrounded by devastation. Children aren't shopping returns. I told him. I didn't raise my voice. I remember that clearly, because it surprised me even as I said it how calm I sounded, how steady, when everything inside me was breaking apart. I think some part of me had known, for months already, that this moment was coming, even if I hadn't let myself fully believe it. Daniel didn't say anything else that night. He simply looked at me, and something passed between us that I understood, even then, as an ending. Exactly 1 week later, he filed for divorce. I think, looking back, that he had convinced himself I would come to the same conclusion he had, that faced with the reality of a marriage collapsing, I would choose the easier path, relinquish the adoption, and we could somehow return to being simply the two of us, unburdened. The way we'd been before Lucy came into our lives. I think he genuinely believed love and marriage were the load-bearing walls of our family, and that Lucy was somehow an addition built onto a foundation that could be removed if it proved too difficult. I filed for sole custody instead. I did not hesitate over that decision the way I know some people expected me to. I had spent a year watching my daughter learn, slowly and painfully, that she was safe, learning that food would still be there in the morning, that closed doors didn't mean disappearance, that loud sounds, while still frightening, did not mean danger was actually present. I was not going to be the second adult in her life to prove her old fears correct. I was not going to be another person who looked at her and decided she wasn't worth the difficulty. Before Daniel moved out for good, standing in the doorway of the house we had shared for over a decade, he said one more thing to me, the last thing he ever said to me as my husband. "You'll never manage alone." I didn't answer him. I simply closed the door gently and went upstairs to check on Lucy, who was asleep with her nightlight glowing and her door propped exactly the way it needed to be. He was wrong, as it turned out. Not that it was easy, it was not easy, not for a single year of it. I worked reduced clinic hours for a long time, which meant tighter finances than I was used to. I became, out of necessity, both parents at once, the one who read bedtime stories and the one who fixed the leaking faucet, the one who understood trauma responses and the one who learned, badly at first and then less badly, how to assemble flat-pack furniture alone in the garage at midnight. There were nights I cried in the shower so Lucy wouldn't hear me, nights I questioned whether I actually had the strength for what I'd chosen. But I never once questioned whether the choice itself had been right. Lucy's healing did not happen in a straight line. There were setbacks, a difficult stretch around age 8 when a new therapist thought would help but instead reopened old wounds, a hard year in middle school when a classmate's careless comment about real parents sent her into a spiral that took months to work through. But there was also, slowly, unmistakably, a girl emerging who trusted the ground beneath her. By the time she was 10, she no longer hid food. By 12, she could sleep with her door closed most nights. By 14, the flinch at loud sounds had softened into something closer to an ordinary startle, the kind any teenager might have. 8 years passed like that, not without difficulty, but with a steadiness underneath the difficulty that I don't think either of us had fully believed possible in those early hard months. Lucy graduated high school this past spring, with honors, a fact that still makes something swell painfully in my chest every time I think about it. I sat in the audience at her graduation, in a row with my parents and Dr. Reyes, who Lucy had specifically asked to invite, and I watched my daughter walk across that stage in her cap and gown, and I thought about the small, watchful 5-year-old who used to hide crackers under her bed. And I could hardly breathe from the size of what I was feeling. She had been chosen to speak as one of the top students in her graduating class, and when she stepped up to the microphone, she looked out at the audience for a moment before she began. "People say blood makes a family," she said, her voice clear and steady in a way that still, sometimes, surprises me when I remember how frightened of loud rooms she used to be. "They're wrong." She paused. "Love does." I don't remember much of what she said after that. If I'm honest, I was too busy trying not to sob audibly in a folding chair in a crowded gymnasium. But I remember every detail of what happened when she came down off that stage, diploma in hand, searching the crowd until she found me. She didn't go to her friends first, or pose for photos, or do any of the things 18-year-olds are supposed to prioritize on the biggest day of their high school lives. She came straight to me, and she wrapped her arms around me so tightly I nearly lost my footing, and she held on for a long moment, right there in the middle of the crowded gym floor, while people streamed around us toward their own families. I think about Daniel sometimes, though less often than I once expected I would. I don't know exactly what his life looks like now, 8 years and a great deal of distance later. I heard, secondhand, that he remarried a few years ago. I hope genuinely that he found whatever it was he was looking for when he walked away from us. I don't carry anger toward him the way I once did. Anger, I've found, is heavy, and I had enough weight to carry already without adding resentment to the load. But I have never regretted, not for a single day, the choice I made in that kitchen at that table, with those 2 cold cups of coffee between us. Being a parent isn't about sharing DNA. It's about choosing a child every single day, on the easy mornings and the exhausting midnights, through the setbacks and the slow, hard-won progress, through every version of difficult that a growing person moves through on their way to becoming whole. Daniel looked at difficulty and saw a mistake to correct. I looked at the same difficulty and saw my daughter, simply asking, in the only language trauma had taught her, to be shown one more time that she was safe. I chose her. I would choose her again, every single time, without a moment's hesitation, no matter what it cost me. Would you have chosen your daughter over your marriage?